Section 58 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. A History of the Past, Part 2. The reader has already learnt the motives which induced Tom Rain to visit the metropolis towards the close of the year 1826. The important information which, during his travels about England in company with Tamar, he gleaned from the gypsy Miranda, led him to betake himself once more to London. It happened that Mr. de Medina and Esther arrived in the capital almost at the same time, for the merchant had not been able to wind up his affairs until that period. Retiring from business with a large fortune, he had resolved to quit Liverpool, a place which constantly brought back the most painful reminiscences to his mind, in spite of his stern resolve to disown his elder daughter for ever. But Esther, had she forgotten Tamar? Oh no, the memory of the fond sister was immortal, and she would have given whole years of her life to clasp Tamar in her arms again. This tender aspiration was speedily destined to be gratified. One afternoon towards the close of October 1826, Esther de Medina was returning home to Great Ormond Street, after having been to make a few purchases in Holborn, when she encountered her sister Tamar, who was also alone at the time. Fortunately, the street where they thus met was in a quiet neighbourhood, and at that moment almost deserted. Otherwise, the ejaculations of surprise and delight which the sisters uttered, and the eagerness with which they flew into each other's arms, might have drawn upon them an attention by no means agreeable. As it was, they escaped any particular notice, and hastening to the least frequented side of Queen Square, they entered into long and serious conversation together. Tamar implored Esther to tell her how their father had received the tidings of her flight, and the younger sister was so overcome by her emotions that she allowed the entire truth to be extracted from her by the questioning and cross-questioning of the impatient Tamar. Thus was it that the latter learnt how she had been disowned, cast off forever. Terrible were the efforts which it cost her to subdue a violent outburst of grief, and her heart seemed as if it would break, when, in a low tone, she addressed her sister thus: "Esther, dearest, my father has no cause to apprehend that I shall proclaim myself his daughter. No, let him boldly declare that he has but one child, thyself. I know not how long I may remain in London, but this I faithfully promise you, that I will appear abroad as little as possible, and then only with my countenance concealed by a dark veil, so long as the interests of him whom I love may compel him to dwell in this city. That we shall be long here I do not believe. Tell our father, Esther, that we have thus met, and communicate to him those assurances that I have now given thee." Esther clung to her sister for support. That language was distressing to the young maiden to hear. "And are you happy, Tamar?" she asked, weeping bitterly. "As happy as woman can be whose father has disowned her, and who is separated from her sister," replied Tamar, now weeping also. "Yes, dearest Esther, I am happy with him whom I love so well, and who is so kind, so fond towards me." "This assurance diminishes my grief," murmured Esther. "Oh, how glad I am that we have thus met! This interview has suddenly relieved me of a tremendous weight of cruel uncertainty regarding thee. But alas, Tamar, why did you desert your happy home? Why did you abandon a father and a sister who loved you so tenderly?" "Esther, hast thou not yet known that love which is so different from the affection existing even between parents and their children, or between those who are so closely linked in the bonds of kinship as yourself and I?" "No." "Well then, Esther, I can scarcely make you comprehend how much more deserving of pity than blame I am. He whom I love so well came to the house. I did not seek him, and my heart soon, oh, full soon, became his. Could I help it? It were vain and idle to say that we can control those feelings which constitute the passion of love. No earthly power could have restrained the current of that attachment which hurried me along to the accomplishment of what became my destiny. And when one loves as I loved and still love, Esther, and as I am loved in return, father, sister, home, kindred, friends, all are forgotten. Oh, this is true, so true, that you ought not blame me, did you know what it is to love as I love." "Blame you, dearest sister!" exclaimed Esther. "Never, never!" And she clasped Tamar fervently in her arms. But it was now dark, and that part of the square to which they had retired for the purpose of unrestrained discourse echoed to no voices save their own. When the sisters were a little more composed, Esther informed Tamar of all that had occurred since they had last seen each other, how their father had renounced the cares and fatigues of business, and had resolved to settle altogether in London, and how he was then negotiating with the Earl of Ellingham for the tenancy of a small but compact estate near Finchley. The sisters then agreed to correspond together, for Esther secretly hoped that her father would not deny her the pleasure of receiving letters from her sister. Tamar was accordingly to address her correspondence to Great Ormond Street, and Esther was to direct her letters to T.J., South Molton Street, where Rainford and his mistress were then passing under the name of Jimison. The sisters were now about to part, when Esther, drawing a diamond ring from her finger, placed it in Tamar's hand. Then taking a small pair of scissors from her reticule, she cut off the end of one of her own ringlets, which, having folded in a piece of paper, she also presented to her sister, saying in her softest, sweetest tones, "Tamar, the love which subsists between us no circumstances can destroy, no length of absence impair. We are about to separate, and, though with the hope of meeting again, still that meeting might be deferred by accidents at present unforeseen. I would that you should possess some memorial of your sister." "Oh, is it necessary?" exclaimed Tamar, in an impassioned tone of profound sincerity. "If not necessary, it would be at least soothing to my feelings," said Esther, "for I possess memorials of you in your drawings and your music. Grant me, then, the favour which I am about to ask you." "Name it, sister," replied Tamar, now deeply affected in her turn. "It is, dearest," continued the amiable Esther, "that you dispose of the ring which I have now presented to you, and that with the proceeds you will have made a locket in which my hair may be set, and on the inner side of which my name may be engraved. This I implore you to do, my sister, and I know that you will not refuse me." "The next time we meet, Esther," said Tamar, in a tone tremulous with emotion, "I will show you the locket." The sisters then separated with aching hearts. On her return home, Esther frankly and candidly confessed to her father all that had occurred. For some minutes Mr. de Medina remained silent, and Esther observed that a tear trembled upon his lash. But the hope thereby excited within her died away when her father turned abruptly round and said, "Esther, you have not acted well. That you should speak to her who was once my daughter is natural, but that you should arrange with her the means of correspondence was wrong. I desire that the first letter which she may address to this house shall also be the last." The Jew then quitted the room, leaving his daughter in tears. On the very next day Tamar wrote a long and most affectionate letter to her sister, and Esther was compelled to inform her, in the reply, of the harsh command issued by their father. But that very severity on the part of Mr. de Medina to some extent, at least in this particular instance, destroyed that frank and open-hearted confidence which Esther had hitherto manifested towards him, and which was inherent in her nature. She could not make up her mind to break off all correspondence with her sister, and yet she dared not receive any future letters at the house in Great Ormond Street. The idea of having Tamar's letters addressed elsewhere naturally suggested itself, therefore, to her imagination, and she accordingly made an arrangement at the post office in Southampton Row, by which the woman who kept the shop consented to receive and keep for Esther any missives that might be thus addressed: ABC, Post Office, Southampton Row, to be left till called for. That same evening Esther wrote another letter to her sister, acquainting her with this arrangement, and we should observe that Tamar duly communicated all these circumstances to Tom Rain, who was delighted to find that she whom he so fondly loved had experienced so much happiness by thus meeting and corresponding with her sister. The highwayman was not, however, a little astonished when he had learned from Tamar that Mr. de Medina was about to become the tenant of the Earl of Ellingham, and it was then for the first time that he communicated to his mistress the full particulars of all that the gipsy Miranda had told him, and which had made him acquainted with his parentage, particulars already so well known to the reader. The 7th day after these events was the 31st of October, a date rendered memorable, so far as this narrative is concerned, by the affair of the diamonds. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the day named that Tamar called on Mr. Gordon, the diamond merchant, in Arundel Street, to dispose of her ring. Rainford would have transacted the business for her, but he was occupied at the time in effecting his negotiations with Old Death, and moreover Tamar considered it to be a matter exclusively regarding herself. We must confess that the idea of possessing the means of procuring a beautiful locket shared in her mind the place that ought to have been entirely occupied by the proofs she had received of her sister's devoted attachment. But Tamar was passionately enamoured of resplendent jewellery, and when in Mr. Gordon's apartments she beheld a beautiful set of diamonds lying in an open case upon the table, the temptation became irresistible. It cannot be supposed that she had been very nearly 3 years the companion of a highwayman without having her notions of mine and thine considerably shaken, and through her brain instantly flashed the thought, wherefore should not I make myself the mistress of those charming jewels, as well as Tom render himself the possessor of a purse on the main road? Scarcely was the idea conceived when she resolved to execute it, and she haggled with the diamond merchant relative to the price which he was to pay for the ring, merely to gain an opportunity to self-appropriate the diamonds. That opportunity served, and she departed alike with the produce of the ring and of the theft. But scarcely had she reached the street when her sentiments underwent a complete revulsion, and she would have given worlds to be able to recall the last 10 minutes. For an instant she paused, hesitating whether she should not return into the presence of Mr. Gordon and restore him the diamonds. Fear, however, prevented her, a fear lest he might consider her deserving of punishment for having abstracted them at all. She accordingly hurried away towards South Molton Street, but during her walk thither she reflected that Rainford might be much annoyed with her for the deed she had committed, and the more she pondered thereon, the more powerful became her conviction that he would be more than annoyed, in fact deeply incensed. She accordingly made up her mind to conceal the circumstance from him, and seek the earliest possible opportunity of sending back the diamonds, by some safe means, to Mr. Gordon. On her arrival in South Molton Street, she found a letter from Esther. It contained assurances of ardent affection, but apologized for its brevity on the ground that it was then already 1 o'clock in the day, and that at 2 Lord Ellingham's carriage was to be at the door to convey his lordship her father and herself to view the mansion and estate near Finchley. She added that they were to dine at the mansion, and were not to return until late in the evening. Tom Rain was present in the room when Tamar read this note, and she communicated its contents to him. 2 nights afterwards he departed on a little expedition, and on this occasion Lady Hatfield was robbed by the highwayman near Bedfont. On the ensuing morning Rainford was arrested and conveyed to Bow Street, but he escaped with impunity in the manner already described. But how great was his astonishment when he heard the name of Esther de Medina pronounced in the court, and with what interest, with what respectful admiration did he survey the sister of his Tamar, that sister who loved her whom the father had disowned. When Mr. Gordon was called forward and stated his name and calling, Rainford began to grow uneasy, for he knew that Tamar had sold him the ring 3 evenings previously. But as the diamond merchant gradually explained the details of the robbery of the diamonds, the highwayman's heart sank within him, for he had no difficulty in penetrating the mystery. He was still meditating upon the course that should be adopted to prove Esther's innocence, when it suddenly struck him that she must have been at the estate near Finchley at the very moment when the theft of the diamonds occurred. The reader knows the rest. Lord Ellingham's attendance at the court was ensured by the intervention of Rainford, and Esther was discharged. Her father, it will be remembered, appeared at the police office just as the case was about to terminate, and the expression which he made use of to his daughter, "Oh, Esther, Esther, I can understand it all. You have brought this upon yourself," is now accounted for. When Esther turned an appealing glance towards her father, as if to remind him of some duty which he ought to perform, or to convey some silent prayer which he could well understand, it was to beseech him to satisfy the diamond merchant for the loss of his jewels, and thus save Tamar from any unpleasant consequences which might ensue were the theft traced to her. But, as we have seen, he affected not to notice that rapid but profoundly significant glance. During the few minutes that Mr. de Medina remained in the court, Rainford was concealed, as it were, or at least shrouded from observation, amongst the crowd, and thus he escaped the notice of the Jew. We should also state that it was on this occasion Rainford first beheld his half-brother, the Earl of Ellingham, whose fine blue eyes indicated a frank and generous disposition, and in whose favour the highwayman was immediately prepossessed. For it must be remembered that his eyes were also of a deep blue, and indicated not only good humour, but a certain generosity of disposition. Indeed, it was only in respect to the eyes and the brilliant teeth that the Earl and Rainford possessed the slightest family resemblance to each other. Yes, it was on this occasion that Rainford first saw him whom he knew to be his half-brother, and the Earl noticed him also, noticed him amongst the crowd of spectators who thronged the court. But he knew not then how nearly that good-looking man with the florid complexion and light hair was related to him. When Rainford returned home to South Molton Street, he upbraided Tamar for the deed which she had perpetrated, and which had involved her sister in such a cruel embarrassment. But he did not reproach her in harsh nor brutal terms. Of such conduct he was incapable. He spoke severely and coldly, manifesting his displeasure in a way which touched her to the quick, but provoked no recriminations. She was almost wild with grief when she heard the narrative of her sister being dragged to a police office upon so degrading a charge, and, producing the diamonds, she implored Rainford to hasten and send them back to their owner. He intimated his intention of performing that duty in person, and ere he went away, Tamar implored his forgiveness. "I have no right to assume to myself the power of pardon," he answered, "seeing that my example has done this. But, oh, Tamar, if not for my sake, if not for your sake, at least for that of your estimable sister who is so devoted to you, abstain from such deeds in future." He then embraced her and issued from the house. In the meantime, Esther de Medina had succeeded in persuading her father to advance the money, advance to her the means wherewith to liquidate the amount of the value at which the jewels were estimated. But in giving the sum required, Mr. de Medina said sternly, "Esther, it is to you only that I concede this favour, and not for the sake of her who was once my daughter, and whom the infamy this day brought to light has estranged more remotely than ever from my heart." He then retired to another room, as was his wont when he wished to avoid an unpleasant topic. Moreover, he thought that his daughter had suffered enough that day to render any further reproach on his part unnecessary, indeed cruel, and he knew that where the subject of conversation persisted in, he should not be able to restrain his ire. The reader has already seen how Esther de Medina called upon the diamond merchant and paid him the sum of £600, the amount at which he valued his jewels. He offered her a receipt, but she declined to take it, for she thought that as she was settling the affair from motives purely honourable and through regard towards another, it would appear as if she were really interested personally in the transaction, were she to reduce it to a mere matter of business. Not that she meditated a revelation of the fact that she had a sister so like herself that when seen apart they might well be taken for each other, and that this sister was the real culprit. Oh no, she would not, even if she had dared, admit that her father had another daughter. And if she lingered, as if anxious to say something more, 'twas merely because her feelings of natural pride prompted her to exclaim, "Oh, sir, believe that I am innocent of this dreadful charge." But a second thought convinced her that such a declaration would not be credited, unless supported by a feasible explanation, and she abruptly quitted the house, bearing the stigma, in Mr. Gordon's eyes, of having committed a deed of which she was utterly guiltless. Scarcely had Esther quitted the diamond merchant's dwelling when Tom Rain called to restore the diamonds, and great was his surprise upon learning that Miss de Medina herself had called and paid the £600 at which they were valued. He, however, left the diamonds, with the certainty that Esther would hear of their restoration either from Mr. Gordon himself or direct from Tamar. Rainford then returned to South Molton Street, where he found Tamar in a very excited state. The occurrences of the day had made a profound and most painful impression upon her mind. The indignity offered to her sister, the certain indignation of her father, the upbraidings of Rainford, who had never spoken to her so severely before, and the bitter regrets which she experienced when she contemplated her conduct. All these circumstances had combined to madden her. Thinking that Rainford was absent longer than the business on which he had set out seemed to warrant, she was filled with the most fearful misgivings. At one moment she fancied that, in disgust at her behaviour, he had abandoned her for ever. Then she imagined that he must have been arrested as the possessor of the stolen diamonds. Her mind was agitated like the ocean in a storm. She went out in a fit of desperation, and purchased some arsenic at a chemist's shop. She returned. Rainford had not yet arrived. She sat down and tried to wrestle with her maddening thoughts, but an invincible idea of suicide dominated them all. She struggled, oh, she struggled bravely against that terrible sentiment, and at length Rainford came back. He exerted himself to calm her, said all he could to tranquillize her mind. He declared that he forgave her from the bottom of his heart, and lavished every token of tenderness upon her. She endeavoured to triumph over the fearful excitement under which she was labouring, but all she could do was to appear calm. 2 or 3 hours passed away, and Rainford hoped she was recovering her equanimity. But a species of delirium suddenly seized upon her. She rushed to the bedroom, and before Rainford even knew her intention, she swallowed the poison. By the time he had followed her into the room, alarmed at the precipitate speed at which she had hurried thither, the deed was accomplished, and the paper which he picked up as she threw herself frantically at his feet explained to him the whole truth. Not a moment was to be lost. Entrusting Tamar to the care of the servant girl, Rainford rushed from the house, and as a hackney coach was fortunately passing at the moment, he leapt into it, desiring the driver to take him to the nearest physician of eminence. The name of Dr. Lascelles was best known to the honest Jarvey, and to Grafton Street did the vehicle accordingly proceed. The physician accompanied Rainford to South Molton Street, and Tamar was saved. But ere Lascelles took his departure, the highwayman had resolved on adopting some plan to prevent any disagreeable consequences occurring in respect to Esther de Medina, on account of this attempted suicide on the part of Tamar. For Rainford naturally reflected that as the physician was constantly moving in society, and must necessarily have an immense circle of acquaintance, it was more than probable that he might, sooner or later, encounter Esther, whom he would mistake for the sister, his real patient. Hence the solemn promise which Rainford exacted from Lascelles, that when once his professional visits had ceased in South Molton Street, he would forget that he had ever beholden Tamar, and that should he ever meet her alone or in company, he would not even appear to recognise her, much less attempt to speak to her, unless formally introduced, when he would consider his acquaintance with her to be commenced only from the moment of such introduction. On the ensuing morning at 7 o'clock, Rainford and Tamar took their departure from South Molton Street, and repaired to Lock's Fields, where the highwayman had already engaged lodgings previously to the affair of the diamonds, as he was anxious, for many obvious reasons, to dwell in a spot as secluded and retired as possible. Tamar then wrote a long and pathetic letter to her sister, imploring her forgiveness for the indignity which she had undergone on account of one so worthless as herself, and requesting her to address all future letters to her, until further notice, in this manner: T.R., No. 5, Brandon Street, Lock's Fields. On the same day that Rainford and Tamar thus removed to the vicinity of the Elephant and Castle Tavern, Mr. Gordon called upon Esther de Medina in Great Ormond Street. Esther was much embarrassed when the diamond merchant was announced, for she feared that if her father were at home, he would naturally hasten to the drawing-room to learn the object of this call, and a renewal of many painful reflections, as well as of much unpleasant observation, would follow. It was therefore with a feeling of pleasure that Esther found, upon inquiry of the servants, that Mr. de Medina had gone out a few minutes previous to Mr. Gordon's arrival. When the diamond merchant mentioned the particulars of the visit which he had received from the light-haired gentleman, Esther instantly comprehended that the individual alluded to must be Rainford; for though she had never seen him to her knowledge, yet she had heard a few details relative to his personal appearance 3 years previously at Liverpool. Mr. Gordon acquainted her with the restoration of the diamonds, and her countenance suddenly assumed an expression of joy, because she could not help recognising a certain evidence of good principle and of kind feeling towards herself in the fact of such restoration. 2 days afterwards, Tamar and Esther again met, and the younger sister breathed the most tender expressions of forgiveness in the ear of her whom, though so guilty, she loved so tenderly. On the following evening they met for the 3rd time, and then Esther used all her powers of persuasion to induce Tamar to accompany her home, to throw herself at the feet of their father and implore his forgiveness. But Tamar answered in a firm tone, while tears nevertheless streamed down her countenance: "It is impossible, Esther. Rainford loves me so devotedly that I should esteem myself the veriest wretch upon the face of the earth to desert him, and on this condition alone could I hope to obtain my father's pardon. No, my destiny is fixed. To him I am linked until death shall separate us. Think not, dearest Esther, that I love thee the less because I cannot, dare not, take a step that would probably unite us again at the blessed domestic hearth, and beneath the sacred roof of our father's dwelling. Oh, God knows how sincerely, how earnestly I wish that such happiness was in store for me. But it is impossible, Esther, impossible." And the sisters parted again, each weeping bitterly. Mr. de Medina had noticed that Esther was absent from home a long time on those 2 occasions, and he taxed her with having seen Tamar again. She did not deny the charge, but falling at her father's feet, she implored him to leave her that source of consolation. Her grief was so excessive that Mr. de Medina, who in his heart admired these evidences of sisterly affection, gave no reply on that occasion. A negative trembled upon his tongue, but he dared not utter it. He recognised all that was generous and noble in the disposition of Esther, and he felt proud of her as his daughter, the only daughter whom he considered himself to possess. But when in the solitude of his study he reflected maturely upon these interviews which were taking place between the sisters, and which, if not at once checked, would naturally become more frequent, his mind was impressed with an idea that Tamar was utterly and irredeemably profligate, abandoned in character beyond all hope, and he feared lest Esther should be corrupted by her conversation. He therefore resolved, painful as the duty was, to put an end to those meetings, and yet mitigate the severity of this blow by winking, as it were, at the continuation of their epistolary correspondence, but still with the firm intention of crushing that indulgence also at a very early period. He knew that oral communication is far more dangerous than written interchange of thought. The former therefore was to be suspended first. He accordingly chose the anniversary of the day on which Tamar fled with Rainford to administer to Esther a solemn oath, binding her never to see her sister again, and to this vow was the unhappy girl compelled to pledge herself. It was the conversation which passed between the father and daughter on this occasion that Lord Ellingham overheard, or rather detached portions of which met his ears, producing such strange misgivings in his mind relative to the purity of Esther de Medina. When the weeping Esther retired to her chamber after having taken that oath, it struck her that her father had not prohibited her from writing to Tamar, and Esther was too glad to avail herself of this circumstance to unburden her grief to her sister through the medium of that epistle which Old Death intercepted and perused, but which he afterwards returned to the letter box in Holborn. And if the reader will refer to that letter, he will perceive that it was specially addressed to Tamar, although when first glanced at, and while the impression remained unfavourable to Esther's character, it might have seemed to appeal to Rainford himself. We have now cleared up all the mysteries relating to the family of Mr. de Medina, and we doubt not our readers will be pleased to find that Esther is indeed a model of purity, innocence, and sisterly affection. Oh, despise not then the Jewess, for Christians might be proud to emulate her virtues. And Rainford was a man who readily recognised and appreciated all the excellence of her disposition, all the glorious traits of her character, though he knew her not. But he enthusiastically admired the soul that could cling so devotedly to its love for a sister, and from the first moment that the sisters met in London, he vowed that Esther should never again be compromised by any act or deed on the part of Tamar, if he were able to prevent it. Thus was it that, on the night when Mr. Dykes and his myrmidons invaded the house in Lock's Fields, Tom Rain gave such positive injunctions to Tamar not to visit him in prison should he be captured, for he feared lest any one acquainted with Esther might meet Tamar under such circumstances, the inevitable result being that the one would be mistaken for the other. But on the day previous to his execution, he yielded to the imploring, beseeching letters which Tamar sent to him by means of Jacob Smith, and consented that she should take a last farewell of him, on condition that she concealed her face as much as possible with a veil. When Esther read in the newspapers of Rainford's arrest, she felt deeply, deeply for her poor sister, whom she knew to be so devotedly attached to the highwayman. And oh, Esther herself had begun to comprehend the feeling of love, for she had not beheld with indifference the handsome, the elegant, and the generous-hearted Earl of Ellingham, and all that Tamar had said relative to the wondrous influence of that passion would at times recur strangely to her memory. Yes, Esther loved the good young nobleman, but her soul was too pure, her manners too deeply fraught with maidenly reserve, to betray the slightest evidence of her attachment. Nor had she yet so far admitted, even in the secret depths of her own mind, the existence of this inclination towards him, as to ponder upon it seriously, or to invest it with the aspect of reality. She knew that he was attached, and believed him engaged to be married to Lady Hatfield, and she sighed involuntarily, scarcely comprehending wherefore, when she thought thereon. Still she loved him, while she believed, in the innocence of her own heart, that she merely felt interested in him as a friend. Nor did her imagination define the true distinction between the feeling which she actually experienced and that which she only conceived to animate her. No, not even when the glowing description of love which her sister had drawn on one occasion of their meeting presented itself to her mind. But she could yet the more easily understand how it was possible for Tamar to love Rainford so devotedly as she did. Hence the acute anguish that Esther experienced on account of her sister when she read the arrest of the highwayman. Mr. de Medina did not of course remain ignorant of the occurrence, but he made not the slightest allusion to it in the presence of Esther, nor did he put into force his previously contemplated plan of forbidding any future epistolary correspondence between the sisters. He felt deeply for Tamar, in spite of his stern silence respecting her, and he would not deprive her, under the weight of such dire afflictions, of the consolation which he naturally conceived the letters of Esther must prove to her. He even gave Esther, though unasked, a considerable sum of money, casually observing that she might wish to purchase herself a new piano or anything else she might fancy; and the young maiden pressed her father's hand, for it struck her that he meant her to be the medium of conveying assistance, in case it should be needed, to Tamar. But Tamar, in reply to the letter which Esther wrote proffering pecuniary aid, gave her the assurance that, though bowed down by the weight of affliction, poverty was not amongst the sources of her deep sorrow. Day after day did Esther fondly hope that her father would speak to her relative to the now unfriended position of her sister, but Mr. de Medina preserved a profound silence. There were, however, moments when Esther fancied that his countenance looked anxious and careworn, as if a struggle were taking place in his mind. Still time wore on, and he said nothing respecting Tamar. He mentioned not her name. But one night, when Esther could not sleep, she thought that she heard a moaning sound in her father's room, which was on the opposite side of the passage communicating with her own, and alarmed lest he might have been seized with sudden indisposition, she stole silently from her chamber and listened at his door. He was pacing the room with agitated steps, and speaking aloud in a manner indicative of acute mental anguish. "Oh, Tamar, Tamar, my daughter Tamar, wherefore didst thou ever abandon me? God of my fathers, that such misery, such disgrace, such infamy should have fallen upon my race! And yet, though I have disowned thee, though I have cast thee off for ever, though, obedient to a stern duty, I have interdicted thy meetings with Esther, the darling of my heart, nevertheless my heart yearns towards thee, my Tamar. Oh, to reclaim thee, to bring thee back to the paths of virtue, to see thee happy and gay as thou once wast! Oh, to do all this I would consent to become the veriest beggar who crawls upon the face of the earth." There was a long pause, and Mr. de Medina continued to pace his room with steps still more agitated than hitherto, while Esther stood in breathless suspense at the door, not daring to make her father aware that she had overheard him, and yet unable to retrace her steps to her own chamber. "But it may not be!" suddenly exclaimed the Jew, in an impassioned, rending tone, for the triumph which he had achieved over his softer feelings cost him pangs as acute as if his heartstrings were being torn asunder. "No, it may not be. I have pronounced the fatal words, Tamar. I have disowned thee, and I may not recall the fiat. But if that man who led thee astray should be cut off by the hand of justice," and the Jew's voice grew tremulous as in broken sentences he uttered these words, "then thou wilt be alone in the world, friendless, perhaps in want, starving. Oh, my God, my God!" And Esther knew that her father was overcome with the bitterness of grief. For a moment her hand was raised to knock at the door, but in the next the thought struck her that she would be doing wrong to wound and even humiliate him by suffering him to know that she had become aware of the sorrow which he devoured in secret. And it also flashed to her mind that beneath the cold, stern, and severe demeanour which he had maintained ever since the flight of Tamar from the paternal roof, beneath also that unbroken, profound silence which he had maintained towards her in respect to the misfortune that had fallen upon Tamar by the arrest of Rainford—beneath all this, there agitated within his breast feelings and emotions keenly sensitive, but which were seldom, if ever, allowed to reflect themselves in the mirror of the countenance. Deeming therefore her father's grief too sacred for intrusion, too solemn to be broken in upon, Miss de Medina stole back to her chamber, and moistened a sleepless pillow with her tears. Nevertheless, a gleam of light penetrated the dark clouds of grief which hung upon her mind, for she had ascertained beyond all possibility of doubt that Tamar was not entirely unloved by her father, that his heart was not a tomb in which her memory was interred. For oh, that heart yearned towards thee, Tamar, lost, fallen though thou wast, and this conviction was an anodyne to the lacerated feelings of thy sister Esther. Time passed on, and still Mr. de Medina remained silent respecting the matter to which the charming maiden daily and hourly hoped to hear him allude. At length the trial took place, and the gallant highwayman was condemned to death. Oh, had it not been for that terrible oath, an oath from which her sire only could release her, Esther would have flown to console her sister at that season of her bitter grief. But alas! all she could do was to impart solace by means of letters, and how cold is even the most fervent language of the pen when compared with that which the heart feels it should utter through the medium of the tongue. Tamar replied to those letters, and Esther was astonished to perceive that the afflicted woman wrote with a certain degree of calmness, but she feared that it was indeed the calmness of despair. A second time did Mr. de Medina place in Esther's hands a considerable sum of money, telling her to use it as she thought fit; and the beauteous maiden, while her heart fluttered with hope and anxious expectation, exclaimed in an appealing tone, "Oh, my dear father, God grant that I do not misunderstand thy motives. Thou knowest that I have no need for all this gold, and she requireth a sire's pardon, but not the aid of his purse." "I dare not understand you, Esther," returned Mr. de Medina, with difficulty assuming a cold tone, but with tears starting into his eyes; and then he hastily quitted the room. Esther saw how deeply he was moved, and hope increased, not diminished, within her gentle breast. Then, when she pondered on all her father had uttered aloud on that night when she had listened at his chamber door, and when she reflected on all his proceedings since the day of Rainford's arrest, she fancied that she could fathom his motives and intentions. "Should my dear, dear sister," she thought within herself, "be left friendless and alone in the world, by the hand of justice striking at the existence of him whom she loves, then, and only then, will the door of the paternal dwelling be opened, and a father's arms be extended to receive the exile once more." At length the fatal morning came, the morning on which Rainford was to suffer, and to which date we have now brought up our history. On the preceding Saturday, Tamar had written to Esther to say that the hours of her bitterest, most crushing trials were now at hand, and that if she survived the soul-harrowing anguish then in store for her, it would be only with the hope of yet finding herself restored, sooner or later, to the sweet companionship of her sister, and also for the sake of the little boy whom Rainford's kindness had adopted, and who was so completely dependent upon her. "The moment all shall be over on Monday morning," added Tamar in her letter, "my preparations to leave London will commence. It is my intention, my firm intention, to proceed to America, and there remain, burying my woes in a strange land, and devoting myself to the care of this boy, until it may please God to move my father's heart to recall me home. Let me receive a letter from thee then, my beloved sister, on Monday morning, a letter that may console me by the assurances of thy continued love, if consolation there be for me in this life. Let your much coveted communication reach me, sweetest Esther, at about 10 o'clock on Monday. May God bless you, dearest, dearest Esther." Accordingly, on Monday morning, at about 9:30, Esther dispatched a letter, by a messenger, to Tamar's lodgings in the city. Need we say that this epistle contained all the tender assurances of love and unvarying affection which the affectionate disposition of the Jewish maiden could suggest, or which were calculated to console where consolation was so difficult? When the messenger whom she had gone out to hire had departed with the letter, Esther de Medina felt too restless, too nervous, too unsettled to return home again immediately. The idea that one whom her sister loved had suffered an ignominious death that morning, and that Tamar was at that very moment crushed down to the earth by the weight of her afflictions, this idea was more than Esther could contend against. She wandered listlessly about, unmindful whither she was going, and it was in this frame of mind that she suddenly heard her name pronounced. She knew the voice, which somewhat recalled her to herself, for it was the voice of Lord Ellingham, whose absence from home had been made known to her by means of the laconic letter which he had addressed to her father from his dungeon. The reader knows the rest. With strange rapidity was she hurried away by the Earl towards Red Lion Street, and in the house to which she was conducted she found her sister, who had arrived there only a few minutes previously, guided by Jacob Smith. End of section 58.
Section 59 of The Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ed Damerow. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. A Father. While the scenes related in the 55th chapter were taking place at the house in Red Lion Street, Mr. de Medina was pacing in an agitated manner his private apartment at his own residence. Esther had rightly divined his thoughts and intentions. He had indeed been debating in his own mind, for some time past, whether his duty as a father and as a man did not command him to forgive a daughter whom the hand of the Lord had so severely stricken. The Jew thought of his wife long dead, and murmured to himself, "Were she still alive, she would be kneeling at my feet, imploring me to pardon the erring Tamar. And does she not now look down upon me from those empyrean heights, where her sainted spirit is numbered with the blessed? Nay, more, do I not see her image now kneeling before me? Oh, can this be imagination? Yes, it is. It is. And yet how like the reality!" Mr. de Medina was so painfully excited that his fancy, for a moment, conjured up the semblance of his deceased wife, as she had appeared in the pride of her loveliness long years before. But when the evanescent illusion had passed away, he again paced the room, a prey to the most painful indecision and doubt. He longed to recall Tamar to his favour, and yet he feared to compromise his character for firmness and decision. So strange and yet so sure it is that, even in those moments when our best feelings are agitated within us to the purest and holiest ends, a miserable sentiment of worldly vanity intervenes, and if it do not altogether mar good deeds, at least impairs the merit of their excellence by engendering hesitation, wavering, and delay. Mr. de Medina's conflicting, battling meditations were suddenly interrupted by a loud knock at the street door, and a servant shortly after announced to his master that the Earl of Ellingham was waiting in the drawing-room. The Jew remained in his chamber for a few minutes to compose his countenance and collect his scattered ideas, ere he descended to meet the nobleman. When he entered the drawing-room, he immediately saw by Arthur's face that it was no visit of mere ceremonious courtesy which was now paid to that house. "My dear Earl," said Mr. de Medina, "you have been lost to the world for some weeks, and I must confess that, when I received the letter which you did me the honour to address to me nearly a month ago, I entertained fears lest business of an unpleasant nature called you thus abruptly away from England." "That letter, my dear sir," answered the Earl, "was not precisely such an one as I should have written to you had I been free from restraint." The nobleman then related, in as few words as possible, the outrage that had been perpetrated upon him, the imprisonment he had endured for 4 mortal weeks, and the manner in which he had escaped. Mr. de Medina expressed his indignation and surprise at the treatment which the young nobleman had undergone, and inquired if the motive could be accounted for. "I am totally at a loss to conjecture who were my enemies, and the cause of their abominable proceedings," answered the Earl. "But let us waive that subject for the present, my dear sir," he continued, "as it is my duty to engage your attention with other and more important matters." Mr. de Medina pointed to a seat near the fire, and then drew a chair for himself to within a short distance of that taken by the Earl. "I am about to mention a name to you, my dear Mr. Medina," continued the nobleman, "which may perhaps—nay, will certainly sound unpleasantly upon your ears. But you know me too well to imagine for an instant that I should thoughtlessly or wantonly give you pain. I allude to Thomas Rainford." The Jew started, and his countenance fell. "This Thomas Rainford, Mr. de Medina," resumed Arthur, "has wronged you deeply, and not for a moment do I attempt to defend his conduct. But how know you, my lord, that the wretched man who is now no more, and against whose memory common humanity orders me not to nourish animosity—" "Mr. de Medina," interrupted the Earl in a low and solemn tone, as he bent towards the Jew, "Thomas Rainford lives." "Lives!" ejaculated Mr. de Medina, in a voice loud with excitement and surprise. "Hush! Speak low, in a whisper. The walls have ears," said Arthur impatiently. "In the name of heaven, compose yourself. Calm your mind, Mr. de Medina, for I have much to communicate to you, and that much of the first importance." "Proceed, my lord," said the Jew coldly. "I am all attention." "It is, then, true that Rainford lives. And yet scarce an hour has passed since men were crying the account of his execution for sale in the street, beneath this very window," observed Mr. de Medina in an incredulous tone. "It is as true that he is now alive, as that he underwent the ordeal of the terrible rope, even as the pamphlet vendors proclaim beneath your window," continued the Earl. "In a word, he has been resuscitated by the wondrous agency of galvanism." "Good God! my lord, is this possible?" cried Mr. de Medina; "or do my ears deceive me?" "Again I implore you to master your feelings," said the Earl, "for I have another circumstance, almost equally strange, to reveal to you. Thomas Rainford is nearly related to me." "To you? To your lordship?" exclaimed Mr. de Medina. "Yes, the same father was the author of our being, though different mothers bore us. He is my half-brother, and all the proofs thereof are in my possession. Nay, more, and this I reveal to you to prove the confidence I place in you. He is my elder brother, legitimately born, and is the rightful Earl of Ellingham." Mr. de Medina gazed on the young nobleman in speechless astonishment, with an amazement indeed so profound that it seemed as if he were suddenly paralyzed by the announcement which had just met his ears. The Earl then rapidly sketched the outline of Rainford's birth, and without in any way alluding to Lady Hatfield, stated that accident had brought them together, and had led to the revelation of all those wondrous circumstances. Arthur did not, however, forget to mention the generous conduct of Rainford in refusing to avail himself of papers which would have placed a coronet on his brow and vast estates at his disposal, and also in consigning those papers to the possession of Arthur himself. Mr. de Medina was perfectly astounded at all he heard, and he listened in silent wonderment, no longer interrupted the narrator with comment or question. The Earl proceeded to inform him how the whole scheme for the resuscitation of the doomed man had been arranged between himself and Dr. Lascelles, and how it had perfectly succeeded. "Indeed," added Arthur, "I left my half-brother just awakened from a profound sleep, and though much enfeebled, still beyond the reach of danger. But spare me the necessity of describing to you the first moments of horror, boundless, appalling horror, which he experienced when, slowly opening his eyes, he awoke to the recollection of all he had this morning gone through, and to the wildest doubts as to where he was and what had actually become of him. Oh, Mr. de Medina, it was a scene which the memories of those who beheld it never could fail to retain, even though madness were to destroy the discriminating powers of the intellect. But all that is past, gone by, and my brother lives, conscious, too, of resuscitated existence. "My dear Earl," said Mr. de Medina, at length breaking the long silence which had been maintained on his part, "I have read and heard many wildly wonderful narratives in my time, truths also far stranger than fictions, genuine occurrences which outvie all the marvels of romance. But never do I firmly believe has mortal tongue related, nor mortal ear listened to, a history more amazing, more solemnly interesting than this. Should these facts ever transpire to the world, and be seized upon by the novelist as the basis of a tale, those who may read, having been previously unacquainted with those facts, would exclaim, "'Tis impossible!" Oh, what a work might be written under the title, "The Mysteries of London!" But pardon me for wasting your valuable time with these comments. I say pardon me, because I perceive that you have more yet to relate. "I have indeed," said the Earl, trembling for the success of the mission which had taken him to Mr. de Medina's house, "and I am now compelled to touch upon a subject which cannot be otherwise than painful to you." "I understand you, my lord," interrupted the Jew. "Proceed, for I know that you would not refer to that topic without a well-intentioned motive." "Such is indeed the case," said the Earl, "but not to use more words than are necessary, as time is precious. I shall at once inform you that I am acquainted with a sad episode in my half-brother's life, which relates to your elder daughter." "Go on, my lord," said the Jew, mastering his emotions. "But not until this morning, till within an hour ago," continued the Earl, "was I aware that you possessed 2 daughters. The moment that Rainford was pronounced to be out of danger, I dispatched a faithful messenger to bring the tidings to her who loves him, and whom he loves so well. But while this messenger was absent, I had occasion to leave, for a short time, the house where Thomas Rainford now lies. An accident led me to encounter Miss Esther. Pardon me when I state that a variety of circumstances, which I will some day explain, had for several weeks past induced me to believe that she, whom I now know to be an angel of purity and goodness, was the being so dear to my brother, and anxious to relieve her mind, as I thought, from the agony of grief into which the supposed fate of Rainford must have plunged her, anxious also that her presence should greet his eyes upon wakening from the deep sleep that followed the galvanic resuscitation. I led her, dragged her with me to the house I ere now spoke of, saying heaven only knows what incoherent things to her as we sped along, and to which I remember now she listened and replied with an amazement since explained. But in the meantime, Jacob Smith, the messenger whom I had sent to your elder daughter, had arrived with her, and thus, you perceive how innocently on my part, the sisters were brought together by the bedside of my brother." "Esther and Tamar together!" ejaculated Mr. de Medina, starting from his seat in mingled anger and surprise. Then, suddenly changing to an aspect of profound sorrow, he murmured, "Oh, Esther, thine oath! Thine oath!" "She did not violate it, Mr. de Medina," said the Earl emphatically. "As well might it be asserted that, had you sworn never to enter my house, and were you carried thither by force, your vow would be wickedly broken. No, Miss de Medina knew not whither she was going. knew not whom she was to see, knew not that her sister would be there. If any one has erred in all this, 'tis I, and yet I, Mr. de Medina, added the Earl proudly, am incapable of doing a bad deed. There lives not the man who, with truth, could impute me to aught that I should be ashamed to have published before all the world. And it is not to boast of untarnished rectitude, of a bright fame, of an unsullied reputation that I now speak, but it is to convince you, Mr. de Medina, a man of the world, yourself upright beyond all doubt, honorable beyond all possibility of impeachment. It is to convince you that if I have incurred your displeasure, I did not the act wantonly, and that I deserve forgiveness." "Excellent young man!" exclaimed the Jew, grasping the Earl's hand, and wringing it with even paternal warmth. "Who shall dare to impute sinister motives to one like you? No, oh no! Were all the scions of the aristocracy as noble-hearted as yourself, endowed with such feelings as you possess, they would be a blessing instead of a curse, and a shame to this country." "I was unjust," added Mr. de Medina more slowly, "unjust towards my beloved and amiable Esther, and unjust also in respect to you. But, oh my lord," continued the Jew, while the tears rolled down his cheeks, it is hard to have the honour of one's name tarnished by a disobedient daughter, and such is the lost, the unhappy Tamar. The best of us in this world are but poor, erring, sinful mortals, in the eyes of him who was all perfect, but who was likewise all merciful," said the Earl in a solemn and impressive tone. "Alas, but a few minutes have passed since I proclaimed my rectitude, vain boaster that I was, and lauded your integrity, miserable flatterer that I was. But I then spoke as men speak, as we mortals are accustomed to estimate our characters for honour and probity. Nevertheless, in the sight of heaven, we are sinners, wretched sinners, and our only hopes are in God's illimitable mercy. Then, Mr. de Medina, as you hope for salvation in another world, as you expect forgiveness at the hands of the Almighty for those failings wherewith the very best of us are characterized, I implore, I beseech you, to pardon your daughter Tamar." Glorious, almost godlike, was the enthusiasm with which the fine young nobleman urged his strong appeal, the stronger for all the sincerity of the argument which prefaced it. Mr. de Medina gazed upon him with mingled wonder and admiration. But when the Earl had done speaking, the Jew turned aside and paced the room in a manner betraying the most painful agitation. "Think not," resumed Arthur, also rising from his seat, "that I am one of those wretched hypocrites, who, in their sickly cant, make use of the holiest names and the most sacred arguments, to win a cause in which they are interested only through selfish and worldly motives. No, I should scorn to reduce myself to such a level. I should hate myself were I capable of such contemptible duplicity. It is not he who prays longest and loudest that is the most sincere. But I appeal to you by all things sacred. I, the Christian, appeal to you, the Jew, by those doctrines which form the basis of the creed in which we both put faith. Doctrines which teach us the goodness of the Almighty, as manifested toward the Israelites, by all he did for your forefathers. Thereby do I appeal to you to receive an erring daughter back to your arms, and ensure her of your pardon." Still Mr. de Medina replied not, but continued to pace the room. "Were your daughter Esther, the amiable, the excellent Esther, here," continued Lord Ellingham, "she would not perhaps intercede so vainly as I. During the rapid explanations which were ere now vouchsafed to me by the repentant Tamar herself, explanations which have shown me how ineffably beyond all human praise is the conduct of the younger towards her elder sister, I learnt more of the heart of woman than ever I knew before. My ideas, my sentiments concerning woman and her mission here have always been of the loftiest kind. But now I am led to recognize something angelic, something heavenly in her disposition. Oh, Mr. de Medina, had I such a sister as Esther, never would I permit a tear to dim the brightness of her eye. If it were in my power to wipe it away, never would I allow a pang to steal into her gentle breast, if deed or word of mine could avert it. For I declare your younger daughter to be a very angel of excellence and moral worth, and your entire nation should be proud of the name Esther de Medina. My lord, my dear Earl, faltered the father, approaching the young nobleman and taking his hand, if the Jews should be proud of Esther, the Christians may, with good cause, glory in their Arthur of Ellingham. But if this must be, if Tamar should once more receive from me the name of daughter, how— I understand you, my dear friend, interrupted the nobleman. You would ask, you would know what course is to be pursued in respect to my half-brother. The Jew made a hasty sign for his companion to proceed. I must confess that this difficulty struck me forcibly ere I came hither just now, continued Arthur. My half-brother is devotedly attached to your daughter, and Tamar is equally wrapped up in him. To separate them, in my opinion, would be the height of cruelty. For you to forgive your daughter and consent to allow her to dwell in concubinage with Rainford are things I know to be incompatible. But is there no course open to them? Listen to the plan which I suggested before I left those who are no doubt so anxiously waiting my return. It is this. Tomorrow night, if Dr. Lascelles accord his permission, I shall accompany my half-brother to France, where he will proceed as soon as possible to the United States of America. For in the hasty explanations which ere now took place between us all, I learnt that he had already expedited thither a considerable sum of money, his intention having been to proceed with Tamar to the New World, when his project was suddenly marred by his arrest. While he is away and in safety, I shall exert myself to obtain his full pardon, for I shall privately represent to the minister all the circumstances of this most extraordinary case. Tomorrow night, then, we proceed to Dover, whence we shall embark for France. 'Tis for you and your daughters to follow us to Paris, and there the hands of Tamar and Thomas Rainford may be united in the chapel of the British Embassy. I am well aware that it will be a Protestant marriage only, that in your eyes it may be insufficient, so far as it regards the creed of your daughter, but it is the least of two evils, for, believe me, Tamar and my brother are so devoted to each other that they would never consent to separate. No, Tamar would not quit him even to receive her father's pardon. Thus they would continue to live in that state which is repugnant to the feelings of society, a state unhallowed by the rites of the Church, where two hearts are thus closely connected and are wedded to all intents and purposes by the mere fact of their binding affections. Tell me, does it matter much at which of God's altars the blessing of heaven shall be invoked? You will pardon your daughter. You will receive her back into your arms. You will give her to one who loves her most tenderly, and who has ever treated her as if she were his wife. And, after the ceremony shall have been performed, albeit a Protestant one, you may say proudly and unblushingly to those who learn that you have another daughter, and who inquire concerning her, you may say fearlessly, she is married. Mr. de Medina walked towards the window for a few moments to conceal his tears. But he could not conceal them, and with a holy dew trickling down his cheeks, he turned again to the nobleman, saying in a tremulous and broken voice, "My friend, my dearest friend, I yield. You have subdued me. It shall be as you have designed it." The Earl pressed Mr. de Medina's hand with fervent warmth, with the ardour of gratitude. "Come with me at once. Delay not a moment," exclaimed Arthur, his own eyes also dimmed with tears. And he hurried Mr. de Medina to the hackney coach, which was waiting at the door. Section 59.